Good morning from the ministries of John Wesley and Sandy Springs United Methodist Church. It's good to be with you again. There are a few little details I need to cover before we get started this morning. And the first one is I've started a YouTube channel. Some people asked about that, so I now have a YouTube channel, and it's Cy Rogers Sermons. And I'd love for you to go there and subscribe, and if you like what you see, just go ahead and like it. Again, it's a ministry to those who can't be in church, or those who just looking for an extra sermon, extra time with God. The second thing I want to talk about is it's a different affirmation this Sunday, and I want to thank John Wesley and Sandy Springs for that affirmation. We have a Bible study, wonderful Bible study, and we were talking about this subject this week, and they came up with a lot of wonderful ideas. And I have incorporated those into our prayer and into our affirmation. Now, the hymnal, Methodist hymnal, has many affirmations, but I prefer most of the time to write my own. It's a good discipline. I encourage you to do the same thing. They don't have to be long. Most traditional affirmations are very short. One of them you have heard time and again: Jesus is Lord. So I invite you to do that. The third thing, church, there are a lot of people still struggling out there. Reach out, telephone call, card. Matter of fact, if you'd like to share this sermon with them, or share the sermon that you've liked the most with them, this would, I think there are people that can be helped by this. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing this. I'm certainly not doing it to get rich. It requires a lot of work, but I enjoy it. Now, the fourth thing, my family says, and my friend says, you need to get as comfortable when you're doing the video is when you're in church. Now, in church, I never get behind the pulpit. I walk, and I don't use notes, and it's very dynamic in church. And again, I invite you, when this thing is over, to come to one of our churches and just worship with us. And listen, we have a wonderful time studying, listening, and preaching God's word. Now, the last thing, the fifth thing that I want to remind you of, is the fact that this sermon, like the one a few weeks ago on demons, this one is going to end up with a poem by the same Lebanese writer, poet, excuse me, and he's also a wonderful painter. And one of my friends, a poet friend, reintroduced me to Khalil Gibran. Originally, I was introduced to my college roommate, George Nalfa. And George, I want to thank you so much for that. And the name of the poem is On Talking, and I've included it in the sermon so that you could enjoy it and maybe share it with others. What we're going to talk about today is 1 Corinthians 13. Now, you've heard this about 1,000 times in weddings. So I certainly have read it a bunch of times. And it sort of stands out because it's not normal language of 1 Corinthians. But it's a beautiful piece of work, and I think it tremendously insightful. It gives us an insight into God and the eternal, whoever wrote it. It's a beautiful thing, and we're going to try to understand this thing called God's love, or better still, agape. And so, from the beginning, about midways, from 1 Corinthians 13, reading verses 8 through 13, I read these words. Love, but not just love, but agape love. Agape love never ends, but as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. For we know only in part, and we prophesy only in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. When I was a child, I spoke as a child. I thought as a child. I reasoned like a child. But when I became an adult, I put away childish ways. For now we see as in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, but then I will know fully, even as I am fully known. And now faith, hope, and love, agape love, remain, these three, but by far the greatest of these is love. I love my car. I do. I love my car, but it's not the same thing as loving my children, is it? Uh, I love my house, but it's not the same thing as loving you and all my other friends, is it? I love spaghetti, but not the same way that I love God. I love God in such a different way. And this is what the writer of 1 Corinthians 13 was trying to get across when he used this word agape. It's a specific kind of love. It's not the love of spaghetti, not the love of a car, not the love of a good movie, not the love of a football game. But agape love is very different, as opposed to eros love, which is sexual love, as opposed to philia love, which is brotherly love, from the word Philadelphia, if you remember that. Agape love is especially God's love. And that's the first thing I want you to sort of wrap around your head. It's a specific kind of love. And in the second thing, it's not just love, but it's the act of love. A better translation would be loving. This is what agape love is. Agape love is not a feeling, but rather it's a force, it's a spirit. It's like sympathy. It's something that we can't help but to feel. It's like compassion. When we have compassion for people, it just comes out. It's just there. And it's not necessarily something that we choose. It's just part of who we are. And like I said, it's a force. It's a drive. It's a spirit. Now, what's interesting about agape love, it's not a love that you would describe as apart from you, like an ice cream cone. No, that's not agape love. Agape love is the act of loving. It's a difference between an ice cream cone and eating ice cream. It's a wonderful, isn't it, to eat ice cream? But that's very different from just an ice cream cone. To help you understand a little bit better what agape love is, I'm going to draw an analogy from this thing that we call a cloud. Now, the cloud actually begins in the ground when the sun heats the water, and little bitty, sort of like when water boils, little bitty droplets of water, they rise up from the lake or wherever the water is, and as they begin to rise up, because they lighted the air, they go into the atmosphere and they keep going up. And as they reach a certain height, they begin to bond with dust particles and they're still there. And then something magical happens to these tiny little water droplets. They begin to attract each other. They begin to join together, and as they join together, they're getting bigger and they're getting stronger, and they do it all this they do all this and the reason is what we call surface tension. Surface tension causes the water to attract each other, and so if you can just picture these little water droplets up in the sky and they're attracting each other and they're getting bigger and bigger, and as they get bigger they get heavier and heavier, and they're moving all together, and by this time we can see the cloud forming, and again the bigger it gets, the more it attracts, and the more water droplets go in, and the more they join, and the stronger they get, the heavier they get, and finally they get so big, so heavy that they fall from the sky, and we call that rain. Don't you love that? Don't you love that? What joins them together is surface tension, and there's surface tension. There's surface tension in our world, church. There's surface tension in our thoughts and in our attitudes. There's surface tension, I think, in when people become angry. There's surface tension when people become puzzled, when people become nervous. And it's sort of interesting. When this happened, people sort of attract each other, these feelings in us. We go to people who are feeling the same thing that we do, and we are sort of attracted to one another, and that surface tension causes these attitudes, these feelings to grow. In church, there's a lot of surface tension in this country today. If you look at Washington, if you look at our politicians, it seems like on one side, all the Democrats have gathered, and on the other side, all the Republicans have gathered. And as they gather, as they get closer to each other, they are drawn because of their thinking, their attitude. And as they are drawn to each other, the feelings they have become more open, and they begin to share those, and they become more vocal. COVID has caused what I call surface tension in this country today, church. There's this feeling of gloom and doom, and we've been under this so long that this gloom and doom that I have is beginning to attract other people, their gloom and doom, and theirs attract mine, and it's interesting, church. We feel stuck, and we feel like it's out of our control, and of course, when that happens, the imagination kicks in, and the gloom and doom just gets stronger as we share it. It gets heavier. And finally, with some people, it overwhelms them. And they can't handle it anymore. The rate of suicide is off the roof. In church recently, this past year, we've seen a lot of this surface tension in our country, haven't we? The Capitol mob, the riots, the burning, the looting, all this came about because of this thing called surface tension. People, maybe 2 or 3 would get together, and they would start talking it up, and it sort of attracted them, and before you knew it, they were attracting other people, and things that normally they would not do alone, suddenly they started doing, because these feelings became heavier. They became stronger. They became a force. And so I'm going to tell you about an experience I had in Paris. 2 years ago, my daughter Rachel and her husband Todd invited Lou and I to go to Europe with them. It was a wonderful trip. I tell you what, we walked and we hustled. And we spent, I think, about 11 days in Europe in several different countries, but we spent about 2 days in France and 3 days in France, and matter of fact, 2 days in Paris. Now, if you're ever in Paris, you're going to have to go and find you some macarons. Now, that's not the same thing as macaroons. Macaroons are made out of coconut, but macarons is a form of pastry, and of course, if you're going to visit Paris, you have to have some macarons. And we went looking for and I remember we took a taxi drive, seems like we went across town. And we went to this wide street, and I didn't realize what it was to begin with. And then it dawned on me, that's the very famous Champs-Élysées. And you've seen pictures of that. You've seen paintings of the Champs-Élysées. They have trees in the sidewalk in this extremely wide street. And there we were, and I was just amazed. And of course, we went into that pastry shop, and there was a long line. And finally, we got our macarons. And when I got mine, I came outside so I could enjoy the Champs-Élysées and look at it. And as I'm sitting there eating my macaron and drinking some coffee, I looked down the street about a block from where I was, and turning the corner into the Champs-Élysées were all these people wearing these green jackets. And suddenly it dawned on me. Some of you remember 2 years ago, there were a lot of riots in France, labor riots, and the people who were protesting were the green jacket people. And lo and behold, when I saw them turning into Champs-Élysées, I thought to myself, "Oh my goodness, I'm going to be witness to a to a protest, to a riot." In church, as they began to come my way up the street there, I was a little bit surprised. Now, they arrested someone pretty near to where I was standing, but I was surprised it was not what I thought. There wasn't a lot of shouting. Matter of fact, people were sort of distance out from each other. They were talking. They were having conversations. They appeared to be just taking a stroll, apart from each other. And I looked at them, and they looked at me, and I thought to myself, well, this is not what I expected. But then that surface tension began to attract them. And as they passed me about a block up the street from where I was, there's this other famous place in Paris, this place called the Arc de Triomphe. And you've seen it in World War II movies. And it seems like this is the point where the protesters were going to gather. And as they passed me, they all started going in that direction. And as they came under the Arc de Triomphe, they began to group. They began to attract each other. And as I watched, then policemen came into the scene. They came by me, but there was no rush. They seemed leisurely. A good many police, but no alarm. But as I'm watching, something was happening there at the Arc de Triomphe. They were accumulating. More of them were occupying the same place. They were beginning to share their emotions and their feelings, this thing again that I call surface tension. And suddenly they begin to become emboldened, and they begin to shout, and they begin to chant. And as they did, the police themselves, they too begin to form, to line up, and they begin to move as almost an army church. And I'm sitting there with myself, and I say, "Self, you about to witness a riot." And I've never seen a riot, so of course I was having a hard time leaving that place. And it was almost like I was being attracted by that surface tension of what was happening there. But it was fascinating, church, as the crowd grew larger and larger. You could tell they were becoming more violent, more vocal, more angry. And the police began to move in closer and closer. In church, I would have moved even closer to see, because I've never seen a riot. But fortunately, my family said, "Daddy, we getting out of here." And they almost dragged me away, but they got my attention. We went and got in a subway, went back to the hotel room, and when we got there, immediately I turned the TV to see what was happening. It was already about night by now. And that's when I discovered that a person had been killed in that riot. Surface tension. This force, if you want, this force of evil, this force of wrong, this force of anger, this force of hatred. But the good news, church, is that there's another side. There's another force, much greater than this force. And this force is the love of God, agape. Agape. the loving of God. And when I begin to think about this, I remember what Jesus says in Matthew when he says, not even the gates of hell will prevail upon the church. The church is stronger. The love of God, the agape, is stronger even than the gates of hell. And then I look at Paul, and I remember what Paul says. He says, absolutely nothing can separate us from the love of God, agape of God in Christ Jesus. In church, I'm here today to tell you that this force, this spirit, lives among us. I've seen it. You see, I've seen it in congregations and in people that instead of talking about Jesus, they live Jesus. Spontaneous things that you don't expect. There's one of my churches, and they found out that this minister who was retired had no place to stay, and there's just love for this minister in that church, and immediately they set to work, and within a matter of a few short months, they had actually taken a basement, just a regular house basement, and made a beautiful apartment out of it. Another church I served, you could tell the love of God came with them. They were building a building, and there were people in that church that said it would be years and years before we paid this off. And they got excited because they knew that their church was having an impact in that community. In church, they paid that loan off in a year. I've seen it even greater in the fellowship of our churches. The love that is developed, the love that they have for one another. And if you come into that church, it won't take you long to realize that they include you in that agape love, God's love, the love that can overcome all things. So finally, I'm going to go back to the clouds. One of the wonderful things about the little rain droplets, when they go up there and they begin to form that cloud, they are all drawn to the center. And this is why the clouds are much darker in the center than they are in the outlying areas. You see that mass inside that cloud, that the water inside the cloud keeps attracting it, and they are always attracted to the center of that cloud. We too are drawn to the center of God when we experience agape love. I'll never forget a mission team went down there to Brazil, and they were going down there to help build a church, and of course a lot of these were businessmen, and then they had some ministers, but the thing that amazed me the most was the businessmen. They began to see the people in that community, and this was a poor section of town. I think that's changed. Brazil has changed tremendously in the past 40 years, but as they began to experience that neighborhood, they began to see the joy of those children. They began to see the need of those children. They began to see the struggle of those children. In church, it's one thing to see it in a book. It's another thing to read about it. It's another thing to experience it all together. And it's interesting, even in a matter of few days, not all, but so many of the people in that group, they began to change. They became more forgiving of one another. They began to appreciate the small things in a way they hadn't before. They became less wasteful. You see, when we experience the struggle of others, when we experience the hurt of others, when we experience the lostness of others, the agape in us grows. And it attracts other people as we are attracted to them. It becomes a force. It becomes a spirit. And I love it. This is why God said, "This is my loving Son." What a wonderful description that Jesus was filled with agape. And it becomes even more evident at the end of his life there in the garden. And as he asked God to pass the cup from him, if you remember this, he says these words. He says, "But not my will, but thine." Church, have you thought of the significance of that? That the agape love of God was stronger than Jesus's will. He was willing to surrender his will to that great love. How about you? What is your surface tension, church? What draws you? So in the same fashion that I did a few weeks ago, I'm going to end with a poem by the same gentleman, Khalil Gibran, and it's entitled "On Talking." And then a scholar said, "Speak of talking," and he answered saying, "You talk when you cease to be at peace with your thoughts. And when you can no longer dwell in the solitude of your heart, you live in your lips. And sound is a diversion and a pastime. And in much of your talking, thinking is half murdered. For thought is a bird of space that in a cage of words may indeed unfold its wings, but cannot fly. There are those among you who seek the talkative through fear of being alone. The silence of aloneness reveals to their eyes their naked selves, and they would escape. And there are those who talk, and without knowledge or forethought, reveal a truth which they themselves do not understand. And there are those who have truth within them, but they tell it not in words. In the bosom of such as these, the Spirit dwells in rhythmic silence. When you meet your friend on the roadside or in the marketplace, let the Spirit in you move your lips and direct your tongue. Let your voice, within your voice, speak to the ear or his ear. For his soul shall keep the truth of your heart, as the taste of the wine is remembered, when the color is forgotten and the vessel is no more. Have you emptied yourself into God? I pray you have. And we as a church all said, Amen.